On February 7, 2018, in the desolate Syrian desert, something extraordinary happened. 350 American Rangers, elite soldiers, the best their country had to offer, found themselves completely surrounded by 5,000 Russian mercenaries and Syrian militia forces. The odds were 14 to 1. Any military strategist, any historian, any rational person looking at those numbers would tell you this was a death sentence. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned in terms of sheer manpower, facing an enemy that had brought tanks, artillery, armored vehicles, and thousands of assault rifles. But in just 20 minutes of the most intense combat imaginable, those Rangers would eliminate nearly 2,000 enemy combatants, destroy dozens of armored vehicles, and utterly shatter an attacking force while suffering 0 combat deaths. Not a single American soldier died that night. This is the story of the Battle of Kasham, one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history, a brutal demonstration of what happens when 21st century technology meets 20th century tactics, when precision meets mass, when training meets bravado. This is a story about 350 men who held the line against impossible odds, and in doing so, wrote one of the most devastating chapters in the history of modern warfare. To understand how this massacre unfolded, how such a catastrophic defeat was inflicted in such a short time, we need to go back to the beginning to understand the context, the players, and the fatal miscalculations that led to this moment. By early 2018, the Syrian civil war had been raging for 7 years. What started as peaceful protests during the Arab Spring in 2011 had devolved into one of the most complex conflicts of the modern era. The Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, was fighting to maintain control of the country. Kurdish forces, organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces, controlled significant territory in the northeast and were supported by the United States and coalition forces. Various rebel groups, some moderate, some extremist, controlled pockets throughout the country. And ISIS, the Islamic State, though weakened and losing territory rapidly, still held defensive positions in several areas. This wasn't a war with two sides, it was a chaotic free-for-all with multiple factions, each with their own agenda, their own backers, and their own vision for Syria's future. The Euphrates River, that ancient waterway that has witnessed human conflict for thousands of years, became an unofficial dividing line in this modern war. Russian forces and Syrian government troops operated primarily on the West Bank. American forces and their Kurdish allies controlled territory on the East Bank. This arrangement was supposed to prevent direct conflict between American and Russian forces, two nuclear powers who had no interest in starting World War III over Syria. A deconfliction line was established, a direct communication channel between American and Russian military commands designed to prevent accidents, to avoid misunderstandings, to keep the peace between two militaries operating in close proximity. But someone, either through ignorance or arrogance, was about to shatter that arrangement. The Conoco gas plant, a strategic facility on the east bank of the Euphrates River, about 8 miles north of the city of Deir ez-Zor, had been liberated from ISIS control by the Syrian Democratic Forces, with significant support from American Special Operations Forces. The facility was valuable, not just militarily, but economically. Control of oil and gas infrastructure meant revenue, meant power, meant the ability to fund military operations and governance. By February 2018, the plant was being defended by a small contingent of American forces, primarily Rangers and Delta Force operators, alongside Syrian Democratic Forces fighters. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were the absolute elite of the American military. Every Ranger had survived the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program, 2 months of brutal testing designed to break most candidates. They had completed Ranger School, 61 days of sleep deprivation, hunger, and constant physical and mental stress. They had completed multiple combat deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Syria. They were physically fit, mentally tough, and tactically proficient. But even more importantly, they were trained in a doctrine that has made the American military the most lethal fighting force in human history. The American way of war isn't about sending masses of soldiers to overwhelm the enemy, it's about precision, coordination, and the integration of multiple combat systems into a single devastating whole. Every Ranger at that outpost had a radio, and through that radio, they had access to an almost unimaginable amount of firepower. Attack helicopters, AH-64 Apaches, bristling with Hellfire missiles and 30mm chain guns, stationed at nearby bases. Fighter jets, F-22 Raptors, F-15E Strike Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons, capable of reaching the battlefield in minutes. Heavy artillery, M777 howitzers, capable of firing precision-guided shells over 20 miles. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, Cold War relics that had been upgraded with modern precision bombing systems, capable of carrying 70,000 pounds of ordnance. AC-130 gunships, flying artillery platforms, bristling with cannons and howitzers, capable of turning a football field into a moonscape in seconds. And perhaps most importantly, intelligence assets, satellites, drones, signals intelligence, a comprehensive picture of the battlefield updated in real time. This is combined arms warfare, the synchronization of ground forces, artillery, air power, and intelligence into a single coherent system. The United States had spent trillions of dollars perfecting this system, decades of training, countless exercises, and hard lessons learned from conflicts around the world. And it was about to be demonstrated with terrible efficiency. But across the river, a very different force was gathering, one that would soon learn a brutal lesson about modern warfare. The Wagner Group, a Russian private military company, had been operating in Syria since 2015. The organization exists in a legal gray zone, officially a private security contractor, but in reality, a tool of Russian foreign policy, a way for the Kremlin to project military power while maintaining plausible deniability. If official Russian soldiers die in combat, that's a political problem. Families ask questions, the media investigates, the public demands answers. But if contractors die, mercenaries die, well, they knew the risks, they weren't officially part of the military, and the Russian government can simply shrug and say, we're not responsible. This arrangement allows Russia to fight wars without officially fighting wars, to exert influence without the political cost of casualties. The Wagner Group had proven effective in Ukraine, in the Central African Republic, in various conflicts where Russia wanted presence without accountability. Many Wagner fighters were former Russian military, soldiers who had served their terms and were looking for better pay, veterans of Chechnya, of Georgia, of other Russian military operations. They had combat experience, they understood tactics, they knew how to fight. But their experience was primarily in conventional warfare, infantry tactics, artillery support, armored assaults, the kind of fighting the Russian military had practiced for decades. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend until it was too late, was how completely the nature of warfare had changed. In the weeks leading up to February 7th, the Wagner Group had been eyeing the Conoco gas plant with increasing interest. The facility represented value, economic value,
strategic value,
and an opportunity. From their perspective, the math seemed simple. The Americans had a small garrison, maybe a few hundred men, defending a large perimeter. Wagner could mass 5,000 fighters, bring artillery, bring armor, and simply overwhelm the position through sheer numbers. This is how wars have been won for centuries: mass your forces, concentrate your firepower, and break through the enemy line. Someone in Wagner's command structure, someone with authority, looked at the intelligence and made a decision. We can take that plant, we have the numbers, we have the equipment, and the Americans won't risk a major conflict with Russia over a gas plant in the middle of the Syrian desert. That assessment would prove to be catastrophically, fatally wrong. Throughout late January and early February, American intelligence assets began noticing unusual activity on the west bank of the Euphrates. Wagner mercenaries and Syrian militia forces were concentrating, vehicles were moving into position, artillery was being staged. The Americans weren't caught by surprise. They were watching, monitoring every movement, documenting every unit. Modern surveillance technology is remarkable. Satellites can read license plates from space. Drones can hover for hours watching specific locations. Signals intelligence can intercept communications. Thermal imaging can detect vehicles and troops even at night. The American intelligence apparatus saw the Wagner Group preparing for an assault, and they saw it clearly. On February 6th, the day before the attack, American commanders sent a message through the deconfliction line. The message was clear and direct. We are observing your forces massing on the west bank of the Euphrates. If they cross the river and approach our positions, we will defend ourselves with all available assets. This was a warning, a chance to back down, an opportunity to avoid disaster. The response from Russian military command was simple, almost dismissive. Those are not our forces. Technically, this was true. The Wagner Group operated as contractors, not official Russian military, which gave Moscow plausible deniability. But it also meant something else, something that should have terrified the men preparing to attack. It meant those men were on their own. No Russian air support, no Russian reinforcements, no Russian military backing. They were about to attack American forces, and their own government had just disavowed them. But the message apparently didn't reach the Wagner commanders, or perhaps they didn't care, or perhaps they believed their own propaganda about American weakness. Whatever the reason, the assault proceeded as planned. As darkness fell on February 7th, the Syrian desert grew cold, temperatures dropping rapidly once the sun disappeared below the horizon. At the Conoco gas plant, the American Rangers went through their pre-combat checks. Weapons cleaned and loaded, ammunition distributed, radio frequencies confirmed, fields of fire established. They confirmed their support assets were ready, artillery batteries were standing by, aircraft were being prepped, coordination with headquarters was established. This wasn't panic, this wasn't chaos, this was professional military preparation. These men had done this before, in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in Kandahar, in countless other battles. They knew their jobs, they trusted their training, and they trusted the system. Around 8 p.m. local time, the first artillery shells began landing near the American position. Not direct hits, but close, probing strikes, testing the defenses, trying to gauge the response. The Rangers didn't return fire immediately. They watched, they waited, they reported. American counter-battery radar, sophisticated systems that can track incoming artillery shells and calculate exactly where they were fired from, immediately locked onto the enemy artillery positions. The information was relayed to American artillery units. M777 howitzers miles away began calculating firing solutions, waiting for the order to engage. Then, around 10 p.m., the main assault began. Dozens of vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks loaded with fighters began crossing the Euphrates River. They used makeshift bridges, shallow fording points, any crossing they could find. Behind them came hundreds, then thousands of infantry. Syrian militiamen, poorly trained but heavily armed, advanced in loose formations. Wagner mercenaries, more disciplined, moving with the kind of tactical awareness that comes from professional military training, followed behind the initial waves. The plan seemed clear: overwhelm the American position through sheer mass, push through with armor and infantry, accept casualties as necessary, and seize the objective. This was how wars had been fought for generations. Mass assault, overwhelming force, victory through numbers. But this wasn't a war from previous generations. When the first enemy units crossed into the engagement zone, about 500 meters from the American defensive perimeter, the Rangers opened fire. 4 carbines, M249 squad automatic weapons, M240 machine guns, precise, controlled, every burst deliberate. The Rangers weren't spraying bullets wildly, they were selecting targets, engaging, moving to new targets. But small arms fire, even accurate small arms fire, isn't enough to stop thousands of attacking soldiers. That's when the Rangers began calling in support, and this is where the true asymmetry of the battle became apparent. The first Ranger to call for fire support was a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, a JTAC, specially trained to coordinate airstrikes. He identified a concentration of enemy vehicles crossing the river, marked the coordinates, and called in an artillery strike. 30 seconds later, American M777 howitzers, positioned miles away, fired GPS-guided Excalibur rounds. These aren't ordinary artillery shells. Each one costs $70,000 and can land within 10 meters of the designated target. The shells arsed through the night sky, invisible, silent, until they weren't. The impacts were devastating, vehicles disintegrated, infantry nearby were shredded by shrapnel, the crossing point became a kill zone. But this was just the beginning. As more enemy forces continued to advance, seemingly undeterred by the artillery, or perhaps not understanding what was happening, the Rangers called in air support. Apache helicopters, AH-64s, lifted off from nearby bases and raced toward the battlefield. These aircraft are purpose-built for one mission: destroying ground targets. Each Apache carries 16 Hellfire missiles, 1,247 rounds of 30mm ammunition, and sensor systems that can detect and track dozens of targets simultaneously. The Apache pilots switched to thermal imaging, and the battlefield lit up on their displays. Every vehicle, every cluster of soldiers, every heat signature was clearly visible. The pilots began engaging. Hellfire missiles streaked through the darkness, each one guided by laser designators, each one finding its target with mechanical precision. Wagner tanks, Soviet-era T-72s, were hit and destroyed before they could even identify where the attacks were coming from. Armored personnel carriers exploded, scattering infantry that had been sheltering behind them. The 30mm chain gun, capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute, raked across infantry positions, each explosive round devastating against unarmored targets. And the Wagner forces couldn't fight back. They had no air defense systems, no surface-to-air missiles, no anti-aircraft guns, nothing that could threaten the helicopters circling overhead. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't defend against. This is the nightmare of modern warfare, the complete helplessness of being attacked from the air with no ability to respond. On the ground, Wagner commanders tried to maintain order, pushing their units forward, believing that if they could just reach the American lines, if they could close the distance, they could win through close combat. But they never got close. As the battle intensified, more American assets arrived, 15 E Strike Eagles. Twin-engine fighters capable of carrying up to 23,000 pounds of ordnance appeared overhead. The pilots coordinated with the Rangers on the ground, identifying priority targets, clusters of vehicles, command posts, anything that looked like a concentration of enemy forces. Then they dropped their payload, precision-guided bombs, JDAMs, joint direct attack munitions, GPS-guided weapons that turn ordinary bombs into precision instruments. Each bomb fell through the darkness, adjusting its trajectory, guiding itself to the exact coordinates programmed into its system. The explosions were catastrophic. Entire sections of the battlefield disappeared in massive fireballs, shockwaves rippling outward, shrapnel scything through anyone nearby. A Wagner convoy, perhaps 20 vehicles, was erased in a single strike. The vehicles simply ceased to exist, turned into twisted metal and flames. The Syrian militiamen, seeing this devastation, began to break, abandoning their positions, running, trying to escape the hell that had materialized around them. But the Wagner mercenaries, professional fighters, veterans, tried to maintain discipline, tried to continue the assault. This was their fatal mistake. About 30 minutes into the battle, the most devastating asset of all arrived. The AC-130 gunship, a modified cargo plane, bristling with weapons, began its orbit overhead. If you've never seen an AC-130 in action, if you've never understood what this aircraft can do, it's difficult to comprehend the sheer destructive power. The AC-130 carries a 105mm howitzer, the same gun you'd find on a tank, mounted on an aircraft. It carries 40mm Bofors cannons, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, now used to shred ground targets. And it carries 25mm Gatling guns, capable of firing 1,800 rounds per minute. All of these weapons point out the left side of the aircraft, so the AC-130 flies in a circular orbit, keeping its weapons trained on the battlefield below. The crew inside operates in an environment that looks like something from science fiction. Screens everywhere, thermal imaging, infrared cameras, low-light television, all showing the battlefield in crystal-clear detail. They can see individual soldiers, individual vehicles, in complete darkness from thousands of feet in the air, and they can engage any target they want, with any weapon system they choose, with precision measured in meters. The AC-130 sensor operators began identifying targets, marking them on their displays, prioritizing based on threat level. Tank at grid coordinates. Infantry concentration at. Vehicle convoy moving toward. Each target was engaged, methodically, efficiently, ruthlessly. The 105mm howitzer would boom, the aircraft shuddering from the recoil, and a few seconds later, a tank would explode on the ground below. The 40mm cannons would fire, streams of explosive rounds, walking across infantry positions, each round detonating on impact. The 25mm Gatling guns would roar, an almost continuous sound, pouring thousands of rounds into vehicle columns, shredding metal, pulverizing anything in their path. One AC-130 gunner later described it in an interview, his voice still carrying a hint of disbelief. It was like playing a video game, except the targets were real. We could see everything, every movement, every person, and they had no idea we were there. They couldn't see us, couldn't hear us over the noise of battle, couldn't defend themselves. They just kept dying. For the men on the ground, the Wagner mercenaries and Syrian militiamen, it must have been like experiencing hell itself. The constant explosions, the screams of the wounded and dying, the confusion, the terror. Shells falling from the sky with no warning, missiles streaking out of the darkness, the roar of aircraft overhead, and nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Some tried to retreat, tried to make it back across the river, but the crossing points were being targeted, vehicles backing up were destroyed, men running were cut down. Others tried to dig in, to find cover, to hide, but thermal imaging doesn't care about darkness, doesn't care about smoke, doesn't care about concealment. The American sensors could see through it all, and the weapons found their targets. Wagner commanders tried to coordinate, tried to organize a withdrawal, but communications were breaking down, radios weren't working properly, units were losing contact. Some reports suggest American electronic warfare systems were jamming Wagner communications, though this has never been officially confirmed. What is confirmed is that Wagner's command and control collapsed. Units had no idea what was happening to adjacent units. Commanders had no clear picture of the battlefield, and no way to coordinate a response. This is what information dominance looks like. One side seeing everything, knowing everything, able to strike anywhere. The other side blind, confused, being systematically destroyed. 20 minutes after the AC-130 arrived, approximately 50 minutes after the initial assault began, the battle was effectively over. The surviving Wagner mercenaries and Syrian militiamen were in full retreat, abandoning vehicles, abandoning equipment, abandoning their wounded, just trying to escape. The American Rangers, following their rules of engagement, stopped firing on retreating forces. There was no glory in shooting men in the back as they ran, no military necessity. The threat had been neutralized. The battlefield fell silent, except for the crackle of burning vehicles, the occasional explosion of ammunition cooking off, and the moans of the wounded. As dawn broke over the Syrian desert, the true scale of the devastation became clear. The battlefield stretched for miles, littered with destroyed vehicles, smoldering craters, and bodies. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, reduced to blackened hulks, some still burning. Trucks and transport vehicles, shredded by cannon fire or blown apart by missiles. And everywhere, the dead. Conservative estimates, based on Russian sources and American intelligence, put Wagner Group casualties at approximately 200 killed, though some reports suggest the number was significantly higher, possibly up to 300. Syrian militia losses were catastrophic, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,700 dead, with hundreds more wounded. Total casualties, approximately 2,000 killed, and perhaps another 1,000 wounded in less than an hour of fighting. The American casualties, 0 deaths. One contractor, not even military, suffered minor injuries from falling debris, not from enemy fire, but from a piece of concrete dislodged by an explosion. That was it. One minor injury against 5,000 attackers in a battle that lasted less than an hour. This wasn't a battle in any traditional sense of the word. It was a massacre, a one-sided slaughter, a demonstration of what happens when a modern military fights a force using outdated tactics. In the hours and days following the battle, the political fallout began. The Russian government, through its Ministry of Defense, issued a carefully worded statement. They acknowledged that several dozen Russian citizens had been killed in Syria, but insisted these were not official military personnel. They were contractors, private citizens, who had chosen to work in a conflict zone, and their deaths were regrettable, but not the responsibility of the Russian state. This was the benefit of using the Wagner Group: plausible deniability, no official casualties, no political crisis. But on Russian social media and in Russian military forums, a different story was emerging. Wagner fighters who had survived the battle, or who had friends and relatives who died, began sharing their accounts. They described the horror of the attack, the helplessness, the complete inability to fight back. They described watching their comrades die, blown apart by weapons they never saw, attacked by aircraft they couldn't fight. Some expressed anger at their commanders, who they believed had sent them into a death trap. Others expressed disbelief at the scale of American firepower, at the technological gap, at how completely one-sided the battle had been. One surviving Wagner fighter, in an anonymous interview, said, "We thought we were fighting men, but we were fighting machines, systems, computers. We never had a chance. They saw us before we saw them. They killed us before we could fight back. It wasn't war. It was extermination." In the United States, the battle barely made headlines. A small article in some newspapers, a brief mention on a few news sites, but nothing major. The Pentagon released a minimal statement, acknowledging that American forces had engaged hostile forces in Syria, that the threat had been neutralized, and that there were no American casualties. Most Americans, to this day, have never heard of the Battle of Qashm. But in military circles, among strategists, among analysts, among people who study warfare, this battle is examined intensely, because it reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare, truths that many militaries around the world are still struggling to accept. First and most obviously, technology matters. Not just having technology, but understanding how to use it, how to integrate it, how to make it work as a system. The Wagner Group had weapons, they had vehicles, they had communications equipment. But they didn't have air power, they didn't have precision weapons, they didn't have real-time intelligence, they didn't have electronic warfare capabilities. And without those things, they were helpless. This is the reality of 21st century warfare. If you can't control the air, if you can't see the battlefield, if you can't strike with precision, you're not fighting a modern war, you're just dying in an old one. Second, training and doctrine matter. The American Rangers didn't just have better weapons, they had better training, better tactics, better coordination. They knew how to call in fires, how to mark targets, how to work with air assets, how to function as part of a larger system. Every Ranger had spent months, years, learning these skills, practicing them, until they became second nature. When the battle started, they didn't panic, they didn't freeze, they executed their doctrine. This is what separates elite forces from regular troops, not just physical fitness or courage, but the ability to perform under pressure to execute complex tasks in chaotic environments. Third, combined arms warfare is devastating. The American military doesn't fight with just infantry, or just artillery, or just air power. It fights with all of them, simultaneously, coordinated, synchronized, each element supporting the others. When Wagner's infantry advanced, American artillery destroyed their vehicles. When Wagner's armor pushed forward, American aircraft destroyed them. When Wagner tried to concentrate forces, American sensors detected them, and American weapons eliminated them. This is combined arms warfare, and when executed properly, it's nearly unstoppable. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, hubris can be fatal. Someone in Wagner's command structure, someone with authority and experience, looked at the situation and made a decision. They saw American forces outnumbered, seemingly vulnerable, and they thought, we can win this. They ignored decades of evidence. They ignored what happened to Iraqi forces in 1991 and 2003. They ignored every lesson of modern warfare. They believed in numerical superiority, in mass assault, in the old ways of fighting. And 2,000 men paid the price for that belief. Today, more than 7 years after the battle, the Syrian desert has reclaimed much of the battlefield. Sand has covered the craters, wind has scattered the debris, nature has begun the slow process of erasing the evidence. The Conoco gas plant still operates, changing hands several times since 2018, now controlled by different forces, part of a conflict that continues to evolve. The Rangers who defended it have moved on, deployed to other conflicts, other missions, other battles. For them, Kasham was another night at work, another battle survived, another entry in their service records. But the battle's legacy remains. In Russia, the Wagner Group continued operations, though with a newfound respect for American capabilities, and a greater reluctance to engage American forces directly. The organization would go on to fight in Africa, in Ukraine, eventually leading to the bizarre armed rebellion in 2023 and the death of its founder, but that's another story. In the United States military, the Battle of Kasham became a case study, a demonstration of effective combined arms warfare, a validation of decades of investment in technology and training. It's taught at military schools, analyzed in think tanks, studied by officers trying to understand modern warfare. And around the world, in capitals and military headquarters, strategists and generals absorb the lesson. This is what happens when you fight the United States military in conventional warfare. This is the price of challenging American technological superiority. This is the reality of 21st century combat. 350 American Rangers, surrounded by 5,000 enemy combatants, outnumbered 14-1, in a situation that should have been a disaster, turned it into a victory through superior technology, superior training, and superior doctrine. They didn't win through superhuman courage, or impossible heroics, or desperate last stands. They won through preparation, through system, through the cold, calculated application of overwhelming firepower. This is modern warfare. It's not about who has the most soldiers. It's about who can see further, strike harder, and coordinate better. And on that cold February night in 2018, in the Syrian desert, surrounded and outnumbered, the answer was devastatingly clear. This is the story of Kasham, the battle that never should have happened, the massacre disguised as a military engagement, and the lesson written in blood and fire across the desert. A reminder that in warfare, as in so much of life, the past is not always prologue, that old methods don't always work, and that those who fail to adapt pay the ultimate price.